Good afternoon, folks. I'm Sinclair Cooper, and with Hunt Companies, I'm actually the vice chairman of the Blueprint 2025 with Norman. Wish you and thank you all for coming here again on behalf of CGLA. Since we're going to be talking about real estate, Norman and social infrastructure, Norman left because he didn't want to be part of the melee that would result in a discussion of social infrastructure, but we're going to plow along anyway. Well, while we're waiting for slides to come forward, there we go. I'm joined today with Dan Feidelberg from the UC Merced. I'm not really the moderator so much as the lead. We are both going to talk about social infrastructure projects, specifically how they relate to real estate, and some challenges and some opportunities and some examples of some successes, both at the federal level, which I'm going to lead off with, and then when Dan comes up, he'll talk about some state opportunities. So just to begin with, again, I'm Sinclair Cooper with Hunt Companies. Hunt is a US-based, family-owned real estate holding company. We specialize in owning firms that specialize in real estate and infrastructure. We are a vertically integrated company and engaged really in every seat at the table. We're on the financing side, both debt and equity. We're on the construction side, and we are developers. We're also in the management facility maintenance side. We're 70 years old and very excited to be partners with Norman. So the whole discussion here of what social infrastructure is, I know a lot of you might not be familiar with what social infrastructure is, and because it deals with buildings, you don't really care much about it, but I think it's important in the infrastructure discussion, particularly in these days, this day and age, when the discussion here in Washington is broader than economic infrastructure. It does actually include social. So I guess it's at least interesting and important to have a discussion as to what it is. Generally speaking, it's social infrastructure ties to assets that have some form of social purpose, ergo the name social infrastructure. And they generally tie to assets like hospitals, courthouses, housing, specifically community-based housing, as opposed to the types of projects that have been talked about before. We are specifically talking about projects here that are public-private partnerships versus design, bid, build, or other forms of contracting. So everything we are speaking about today is not only social infrastructure, but also some form of public-private partnership. So as we think about social infrastructure, specifically at the federal level, kind of where do you start? And from our standpoint, it's the easiest place to start is at the goal line that we are trying to get to, and that is long-term life cycle sustainment. That's particularly important when you're talking about the development of some new asset, but also dealing with deferred maintenance, because as you'll see, most of the public infrastructure projects that have happened at the federal level that are social projects have all been projects that have moved forward to address existing deferred maintenance problem. They generally all have some form of aggregation or securitization of revenue streams, whether those revenue streams are existing revenue streams or future revenue streams. And Chairman Micah, who used to be chairman of the Transportation Infrastructure Committee back in the 113th Congress, had a saying about not sitting on our assets. And I think the monetization of assets is another conduit to value that has been utilized at the federal level to make projects more valuable and more viable. And last but not least, since projects that are public-private partnerships are trying to solve and address a mission of a public sector entity, generally what the private sector is looking to layer on are other types of uses that are compatible with whatever the public use, but offer an opportunity for the private sector to make increased revenue and to make, in some cases, the project that was not viable more viable. A first example of that has been around for 20 plus years and is really one of the longest successful P3 efforts at the federal level is the Military Housing Privatization Initiative. Began in 1996. It was created to solve a problem of backlog deficit maintenance, $16 billion at the time, and that's in 1996 dollars. It would have taken the federal government 20 years to appropriate their way out of that hole. There was a lack of quality of life on the military installations. The program was designed to specifically address on-base military housing in and around the continental United States, specifically to deal with family housing as opposed to barracks. So the program was implemented. The basic structure is a ground lease of all the land where the housing assets and infrastructure exist. The buildings are transferred as a function of that ground lease. The private sector entity is then given essentially a 50-year concession to own, operate, redevelop, finance all the necessary improvements, both for renovating existing or building new on that military installation. The revenue stream on the capital side, mostly 85% of these transactions were financed through bonds, mostly taxable bonds, the CMBS market. There were in many instances the services layered on subordinate debt or loan guarantees, and then very small slivers of equity from the private sector, from us. The operating side is financed from something called Basic Allowance for Housing. That's an allowance that active duty service members receive. It is determined by rank, so a sergeant's basic allowance for housing is not the same as a general, and it's also determined by region. So in Hawaii, the basic allowance for housing for a general is not the same as in Kansas City, Missouri, because the basic allowance for housing rates track the regional values and markets for housing. So an example of a project that we were involved in, one of the larger projects with the Air Force, involved the transferring of close to 3,000 housing units to a single project. The project's known as the BLB Group. It is represented by 3 separate Air Force installations, one in Barksdale, Louisiana, Langley Air Force Base, and Bolling Air Force Base, which is right down the street. The project included an aggregation or bundling of these 3 assets for the purpose of averaging out revenue streams. I talked about the fact that revenue streams are different in different places. DC is rather high, Louisiana is very low. The project need in Louisiana was mostly historic renovation versus the project need here was mostly new construction. So the project was grouped to provide that scale so as to bring a scaled revenue stream to be monetized and put us in a position where we could make the largest amount of impact. $1 billion project, again, it's a 50-year concession and a 50-year relationship between us and the Air Force. Another program like this that exists at the federal level is a program that HUD administers, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. It's a program known as the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program. Again, created because of a significant backlog deficit throughout the United States, $26 billion. It was a problem that the federal government, HUD, could not appropriate their way out of. So they created this program as a mechanism to convert housing from a public ownership into a private ownership through a public-private partnership. The projects were again conveyed through ground leases. The improvements conveyed along with those ground leases. The revenue stream is an operating lease format. It's technically called a Section 8 contract, but these Section 8 contracts are project-based. They're tied directly to the project themselves. They're either 15 or 20-year durations with automatic renewal. So it gives us in the private sector the ability to have a sustained revenue stream that we can then monetize and lever so as to bring in private sector debt. On the previous slide, I forgot to reference the leverage for the military housing projects. It was essentially 8 to 1, 8 private dollars to every 1 public dollar. For this RAD program, we're now at essentially 9 private sector dollars to 1 public dollar. So it's a real opportunity, and it's a real live executed program to really bring in significant private capital to solve a social housing issue. Example of a project that we're involved in, it's actually the largest of these projects in the United States, 1,600 units in El Paso, Texas. Again, the key points that we've been making about the land transfer to ground lease. We dealt with all the deferred maintenance for the projects. There was aggregation tied to scale. That was really one of the most key components. This project aggregated or bundled 13 separate communities into one large transaction, $250 million in cost and in financing brought to the table. For this particular project, we had about 11 to 1 leverage, 11 private dollars to 1 public dollar. And that additional juice, if you will, was brought to bear because of the aggregation. The aggregation brought or saved about $31 million in cost because of the scale and the economies of scale that we were able to achieve. So those are programs that exist. Those are programs that have history. There are some new programs and new ideas being talked about today in the federal government to address the same types of issues that we've just talked about. One specific department, and I have to tell you in advance, these are my ideas, not the Department of Veterans Affairs. They told me to use that editorial. We have presented these ideas to them. The Secretary is obviously part of the infrastructure roundtable that meets in the White House every Wednesday, and they are working towards a broad participation in the President's infrastructure plan. So they couldn't necessarily comment on any of my ideas, but they certainly are including these and others in there as they move forward to finalize their portion of the administration's plan. But the themes are the same: pooling together different asset classes to be built simultaneously so as to achieve scale, acquisition or bundling or aggregation of the backlog maintenance through a transfer of the asset, lease-back arrangement, and we'll get into the structure in a minute, and transferring the ownership and operation of the traditional nursing homes, or which are now called community learning living centers. So to start with the first, VA has a responsibility of building clinics, hospitals, offices, housing all over the country. They currently do these at a very lumpy arrangement. They probably have a backlog today of close to 50 projects that are authorized but have not been executed. One solution to that we have proposed is bundling or aggregating all of these together, either regionally or as one big tranche, conveying them all as part of one large leaseback. Veterans Affairs would still be involved in operating the hospital facilities, but the private sector would be responsible for everything else. One of the key components to trying to show private sector participation in these types of efforts are making sure there's room for layering on other activities on the asset. So, such as parking, utilizing the surrounding land that is involved in the ground lease to either bring retail or other opportunities to increase the value of the project. The same basic structure with respect to the deferred maintenance acquisition. This would be very similarly structured to the military housing projects, where you would simply bundle a variety, either regional, of these existing assets. You're acquiring the backlog deficit that exists through those particular assets. You have a leaseback arrangement with the VA facility that would be your revenue stream that you would then lever and monetize. And by doing this in a regional basis, you gain the economies of scale necessary to really bring the bang for the buck here to the private sector. Again, the ability to layer on other private sector uses, parking, et cetera, to juice the transaction to make it even more valuable. And then lastly, as I talked about, VA owns these, what are used to be called nursing homes, now they're called these community living centers. That's their tagline. About 6 million square feet of assets all across the United States. They're currently operated very inefficiently by Veterans Affairs. If you put yourself in a situation from the private sector where all this is conveyed, private sector through a performance-based operations contract is in a position to provide the services at a value and a benefit to the government and be in a position to save the government money and provide more efficient and effective execution of sustainment. Structure, we've talked about on pretty much ground lease at the base, ground lease of the land and a conveyance of the improvements. The private sector gains the ability to do the development or correcting of the renovation of the new construction through what is called an enhanced use lease. An enhanced use lease is simply a term of art. It essentially conveys the ability for the private sector to execute beyond simply ownership on public land. The VA continues to occupy these assets. There's a leaseback arrangement as long as possible, but generally probably couldn't get longer than 20 years. VA continues to be on the deliverable hook for the actual healthcare services, but there's opportunities for the private sector to do other things. So what are the obstacles? One of the clear obstacles in this town with anything having to do with the federal government is a commitment to sustainment. Most people in Washington, D.C. think in 2 and 4 year clips, in some cases 6, because those tie to election cycles. So it's very hard to get people to focus on the need to invest and sustain assets. Think about an asset not in terms of this bright, shiny set of keys you have in your pocket, but an asset that has to last 50, 70, 100 years. Secondly is being in a position to have a consistent evaluation of how a public-private partnership can work. The concept of value for money is an internationally in market industry known word and concept of evaluation of transactions. Most folks in the world are effectively utilizing that process to determine what works and what doesn't work. In this country, we do it a little lumpy. There's states who have created things called centers of excellence and other things like that that have been useful, but at the end of the day, they have not. We don't have a real consistent and transparent way of doing it. And last but not least, O&B Budget Circular A11, that's something that specifically and uniquely ties to federal assets. It's something that has been talked about in this town for 20 years in terms of how to change it in order to make public infrastructure at the federal level more friendly to private sector investment. It's certainly on the list of things to be looked at by the current administration. So in terms of next steps, we obviously have an infrastructure plan that will be presented by the White House sometime between August and October. That infrastructure plan will include executive orders. Those executive orders will allow for the immediate execution of things like hopefully these changes to A11 that will allow some immediate projects to move forward. And then that all has to be codified by legislation, and then ultimately the projects get to be implemented. So that's the view from the federal side. I want to bring Dan in to talk about some exciting things that have happened in California, and specifically UC Merced. Dan.